there is a new product that delivers on every miniature painter's dream, making painting faster, easier, and the ability to paint when and wherever inspiration strikes. This new magical product that unlocks these secrets, Army Painter Speedpaint Markers. But what happens if you try to DIY these magical products at home? Spoiler, it's not what you'd expect. So let's explore the success and failures of building a DIY alternative to a product that's being hyped as the future of miniature painting. Before we go into my homemade attempt though, let's talk about what Army Painter is creating. The new Speedpaint markers are being marketed around two big promises: painting anywhere without the usual setup, so no brushes, palettes, or water, and consistent pigment flow with smooth, streak-free coverage. Each marker comes with a felt tip for precision and a unique push tip into lid priming system that gets the paint flowing without the usual mess. At launch, the markers will be available in two sets: the intro set, which includes 3 bold foundational colors, and the starter set, which comes with 10 colors, including a metallic. Altogether, they're positioned as a portable, grab-and-go painting solution that makes miniature painting easier, faster, and more accessible wherever you are. Obviously, the Speedpaint markers don't release for another few weeks, so I can't do an official side-by-side comparison. But based on the previews and reviews, I think that I've gathered enough information to take a shot at building my own DIY version. So let's see how close we can get. For my DIY version, I'm focusing on recreating the 2 big promises: being able to paint with no setup and even streak-free coverage. Once I've covered those basics, we'll go a little deeper and talk about the broader picture. Things like how wide the color range really is when you're making your own, what unique twists come with building a DIY version, and of course, the big one: cost and availability. The first goal is easy and straightforward: painting with no setup. For my DIY testing, I picked up the U-Pins 12-piece water brush pen set, which includes 6 flat brushes and 6 pointed brushes in a variety of sizes. These pens have basically the same promise as the Speedpaint markers: no messy setup. They're normally designed for watercolors or inks with a squeezable barrel that lets you control the flow as you paint. Overall, the reviews on Amazon were positive, but I didn't find anyone using them quite the way I planned to, so that just makes for a more interesting test. Before we start testing, let me know in the comments: would you rather pay more for polished convenience or hack together your own version for cheap? Before I started YouTube, I used to be a DM, and nothing is more stressful than when your players skip that session's plans and instead decide to wander into the caves that you mentioned 3 sessions ago. That's where Ready Set Encounter saves the day. No prep, no panic, just cinematic RPG action in a box. Inside you'll get dozens of epic draconic miniatures, from a towering red dragon tyrant to dragonborn cultists and kobold worshippers, plus 10 modular map tiles, dungeon tokens, action-packed monster stat blocks, and unique combat objectives so you never have to deal with hit point slog again. And with level scaling design and modular pieces, every adventure adapts to your group and stays infinitely replayable. So if you're ready to look like a pro DM, check out Ready Set Encounter live on Kickstarter now. Link in my description box. To start, I loaded one of the thin brushes with Army Painter's Nuclear Sunrise. The process was straightforward. I unscrewed the brush, squeezed a good amount of the speed paint into the reservoir, and then sealed it back up. To prime the brush, I had to squeeze the handle several times until the paint finally saturated the bristles. It took a bit of effort and honestly a few minutes of fussing, but eventually the pigment worked its way down the brush and began flowing smoothly. It is important to have the right amount of paint in the brush. Too little and the paint acts more like a stain than a speed paint. We want the bristles to be fully saturated so we can apply a good amount of paint to allow it to sink into the recesses as we would usually expect. On the other hand, if you have too much paint in the bristles, the paint may drip off the brush. I quickly discovered a rhythm that kept things moving: brush, brush, squeeze. That little cycle helped keep paint flowing through the bristles and allowed me to continue painting. The last thing is that there is no way you are getting any sort of tiny detail with these brushes. And these brushes were pretty hard to navigate. The handle and the bristles are so large, I kept painting in spots I didn't want to. But here's where I wanted to push things a bit further, because my DIY version has a really cool, unique feature that the Speedpaint markers don't. A variety of tips and brush sizes. For my lizard mount, I loaded up one of the larger flat brushes with algae green speed paint, hoping this would become a key advantage of the homemade system. If I can get consistent coverage with the bigger tip, I can cover more ground faster than a fine tip marker ever could. In theory, this is a goldmine. In practice though, not so much. The larger tip was much harder to saturate, and it took quite a bit of squeezing before the paint actually flowed properly. Once it did, the brush laid down paint decently smooth, but control became a real issue. Finagling this oddly shaped brush took time. And that time meant my speed paint began to dry before I was fully finished, causing me to overlap my speed paint application, leaving uneven textures across the surface. To really test this, I compared it head to head with a regular brush. On these dragon wings, I used the DIY brush pen for one wing and a standard large round brush with a palette for the other. The results were pretty noticeable. The brush pen couldn't keep up. The paint flow lagged behind, I had to constantly squeeze and reload, and the finish ended up patchy and uneven. Meanwhile, the regular brush was faster, smoother, and far more consistent. I know this isn't really a fair comparison, but I wanted us to have a baseline for what we were looking at. And honestly, this experiment gave me a bit of insight into the design choices behind the official Speedpaint markers. Maybe there's a reason the Speedpaint markers don't come with larger tips, because my attempt at scaling up definitely didn't work. And since convenience is such a big staple for the Speedpaint markers, I wanted to see how my DIY versions would last over time. I set my DIY versions aside and came back to them 2 days later. And to my surprise, everything worked surprisingly fine. It was just a few squeezes and the paint started flowing again right away. Now I have seen complaints in the reviews about these markers drying up or beginning to leak. So obviously your mileage may vary. And since I've only been using these for a few days, I also can't attest to how well they're going to hold up long term. But for my early tests, they've been doing quite well. As for durability, the nylon bristles have held their shape so far. I definitely wouldn't say that these pen brushes have good brush tips, but they get the job done. And like any synthetic brush, I do expect them to begin to curl and fray over time. That's another place where the engineered felt tip of the Speedpaint markers could come in handy, especially since each package contains extra. So now that we've seen what my DIY versions can do, let's step back and compare my versions to the two big promises of the official Speedpaint markers, as well as looking at a few other pros and cons. First, our two big goals. No setup required. Check. Both the official markers and my DIY brushes deliver on this front. You can just uncap and start painting, which really does make the process faster and easier. Second, precise flow and even coverage. This one had mixed results. With the smaller brush tips on my DIY version, flow and coverage were solid. I could paint small areas with decent control and keep their colors even, just like I've seen the Army Painter Speedpaint markers do. But once I moved to the larger brushes and tip sizes, things began to fall apart. Color selection. Here is where the DIY system really shines. Right now, Army Painter is only launching their markers with 2 sets, a 3-color intro set and a 10-color starter set, which is a tiny slice of their Speedpaint range, which has like over 200 colors. With DIY, the world is wide open to you. You can fill your markers with any speed paints you own, mix custom colors, even load contrast paints or washes. The downside, you'll have to organize and label everything yourself, which definitely cuts into the convenience. Availability. As of now, the official Speedpaint markers are still in pre-order. However, I'm sure that once they are officially released, you'll be able to find them at basically any hobby store. On the other hand, these brush pens were available on Amazon with 2-day shipping. So if you want the speed paint markers now, DIY obviously wins. Long term, not so much. Price. This is where things get interesting. The intro set of 3 markers costs just over $17, which works out to be about $5.50 per marker. That's the same price as a full bottle of speed paint, but there's a catch. The speed paint bottles come with 18 milliliters of paint, compared to the speed paint markers, which come with 6 milliliters of paint. Clearly, that marker aspect is pretty expensive. My DIY brush pen set cost $8 for a total of 12 brushes. With this math, I could put together my own 3-color set for a total of $1.50 in markers and $6 worth of speed paint to fill each one of those markers up to about 6 milliliters. Therefore, my 3-color set would cost about $7.50 or $2.50 per marker. That's less than half the cost of the official markers. The trade-off is quality and convenience. You're saving money, but you're spending more time on the setup. One other factor to consider is reusability. These brushes can be rinsed and used again with different colors. If you're planning on switching colors, this cleanup eats into the convenience that you're buying. In practice, I found it easier just to make a unique marker per color. However, that does mean you are going to be purchasing a lot of speed paint markers and setting up a lot of time filling them all up. In the end, it all comes down to trade-offs. If you want convenience and reliability and don't mind spending the extra money, then the official markers are the obvious choice. But if you enjoy tinkering, customizing, and want to save a bit of money, while accepting the quirks that come along with it, the DIY route is surprisingly fun and opens the door to customization that the official speed paint markers never could. For me personally, I don't see myself using either of these options. Convenience just isn't a high priority for me. And if I want to use speed paints, I want to use the best speed paints I can. And in this testing, I've just come to find that nothing beats the original brush application. But I want to know what you think. Are the official speed paint markers for you? Would you give my DIY version a try? Or are you like me who likes the tried and true traditional painting methods? If you like what I do, you know the drill. Like, comment, subscribe. You can buy my merchandise. You can support me over on Patreon. I will be teaching at Dragonfall in Lake Geneva at the beginning of this October. If you've ever wanted to take classes by me, Runic Raccoon, Dan Dougal, or a bunch of other amazing people at a absolutely gorgeous resort, then you should give Dragonfall a look. Alright, thanks so much. I'll see you next time.